The warning that changed everything. The airport terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of a Monday morning. Marcus Chin stood at gate 47, adjusting his designer watch as he scrolled through emails on his phone. The CEO of Tech Vision Industries had built an empire worth $3 billion, and everyone in the business world knew his name. His private jet waited on the tarmac, fueled and ready for the flight to Singapore, where a merger deal worth $500 million awaited his signature. Everything was going according to plan, as it always did in Marcus's meticulously organized life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. That's when he heard it. A small voice, clear as a bell, cutting through the noise of rolling suitcases and gate announcements. "Mister, your plane is going to crash. You can't get on that plane." Marcus looked down. A little girl, no more than 7 years old, stood before him. She had wild curly hair pulled into 2 uneven pigtails, wearing a faded purple jacket that had seen better days. Her sneakers were scuffed, and there was a small tear in her jeans. But her eyes, those dark brown eyes, held something that made Marcus pause. They weren't the playful eyes of a child making up stories. They were serious, almost pleading. "Excuse me?" Marcus said, his voice carrying that edge of irritation he used in boardrooms when someone wasted his time. "Your plane," the girl repeated, pointing at the window where his sleek private jet sat gleaming in the morning sun. "It's going to crash. I saw it. You need to listen to me." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. He looked around for the girl's parents, expecting some embarrassed adult to rush over and apologize for their child's imagination running wild. Instead, he saw a man approaching, carrying 2 worn duffel bags and wearing a janitor's uniform with the airport logo stitched on the chest. The man's face was creased with exhaustion, the kind that comes from working double shifts and sleeping too little. "Emma, sweetheart, what did I tell you about bothering people?" the man said softly, reaching for the girl's hand. He looked up at Marcus with apologetic eyes. "I'm so sorry, sir. She's just a kid with a big imagination. We'll get out of your way." But Emma pulled her hand back, stepping closer to Marcus instead. "Daddy, I'm not making it up. I saw it when I closed my eyes during breakfast. His plane, the white one with the blue stripe, it's going to have engine trouble over the ocean. Please, mister, you have to believe me." Marcus felt heat rise to his face. A crowd was beginning to gather, and he could see phones being raised, probably recording this bizarre interaction. The last thing he needed was some viral video of a child predicting his death going around social media before his crucial business meeting. "Listen," Marcus said, his voice cold and clipped. "I don't know what kind of game this is, but I have an important meeting to get to. My jet has been inspected by the best engineers money can buy. Now, if you'll excuse me." He stepped around the girl, but she grabbed the edge of his cashmere coat. "Please. I'm not lying. My daddy taught me to always tell the truth, and I'm telling you the truth right now." The janitor, Emma's father, gently pulled her back, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Emma, that's enough. I'm so sorry, Mr. Chen. Really, we didn't mean to cause a scene." Marcus froze. "How do you know my name?" The janitor gestured weakly at the departure board, where Marcus's flight was listed. "Your name's on the private charter listing, sir. Everyone knows Tech Vision. Look, we're really sorry. Emma sometimes gets these feelings, and she thinks they're real, but we're working on helping her understand the difference between imagination and reality." A security guard had noticed the commotion and was making his way over. Marcus could see the judgment in the eyes of the other travelers. Some looked amused, others annoyed at the delay. A woman in a business suit whispered to her companion, loud enough for Marcus to hear, "Can you imagine? Letting your child harass people like that? Some people shouldn't be parents." Marcus felt a strange twist in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't pity, exactly, but something close to it. The janitor's uniform was clean but worn, and there was a name tag that read David Miller. The man's hands were rough from years of hard work, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of endless fatigue. This was a man who was doing his best with what little he had, and his daughter, despite her outlandish claim, clearly loved him fiercely. But Marcus had a plane to catch and a fortune to secure. He nodded curtly at David and walked toward the boarding gate, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished floor. Behind him, he heard Emma's voice one more time, now thick with tears. "Please, mister. I don't want you to die." Marcus didn't look back. Marcus settled into the plush leather seat of his private jet, accepting a glass of champagne from his flight attendant, Rebecca. The interaction at the gate already felt like a distant annoyance, something to laugh about later at dinner parties. A janitor's daughter predicting plane crashes. What would they think of next? "Everything all right, Mr. Chen?" Rebecca asked, noticing his distracted expression. "Fine," Marcus replied, waving her away. "Just some nonsense at the gate." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Let's get moving. I need to be in Singapore by 6. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, smooth and professional. "Good morning, Mr. Chen. This is Captain Williams. We've got clear skies ahead and should have a smooth flight. We'll be taking off in about 5 minutes." Marcus closed his eyes, trying to focus on the presentation he'd be giving in Singapore. But Emma's face kept appearing in his mind. Those serious eyes. The desperation in her voice. And her father, David, trying so hard to maintain dignity while apologizing for something his daughter believed with her whole heart. The engines roared to life, and Marcus felt the familiar sensation of the plane beginning to taxi. He opened his laptop, determined to push the morning's strangeness out of his mind. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let the words of a child shake him now. Marcus had built Tech Vision from nothing. 20 years ago, he'd been just another immigrant kid from a struggling family, working 3 jobs to put himself through community college. His parents had died in a car accident when he was 19, leaving him alone in a country that felt both full of opportunity and crushingly indifferent. He'd promised himself he would never be powerless again, never be overlooked or dismissed. And he'd kept that promise. Every meeting, every deal, every acquisition had been a step toward becoming untouchable. But somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten what it felt like to be on the other side. To be the person everyone looked past. To be the janitor instead of the CEO. The plane lifted off the runway, and Marcus watched Chicago grow smaller beneath him. Lake Michigan sparkled in the morning light, and for a moment, everything felt exactly as it should. Control. Power. Success. Then, 20 minutes into the flight, he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. A grinding, mechanical screech that made his stomach drop. The plane shuddered, and Marcus's laptop slid off the table, crashing to the floor. Rebecca stumbled, catching herself against a seat. The champagne glasses shattered in the galley. Captain Williams's voice came over the intercom again, but this time it was tight with barely controlled panic. "Mr. Chen, we're experiencing engine failure in the starboard engine. We're going to need to turn back immediately. Please remain seated and buckle your seatbelt." Marcus's hands gripped the armrests as the plane banked sharply. Through the window, he could see black smoke trailing from the right engine. His heart hammered against his ribs. Emma's words echoed in his mind like a prophecy coming true. "Your plane is going to crash." The next 30 minutes were the longest of Marcus's life. The pilots fought to keep the plane stable as they made an emergency descent back toward Chicago. Fire trucks and ambulances lined the runway, their lights flashing like a warning Marcus should have heeded hours ago. When the wheels finally touched down, rough and hard but mercifully on solid ground, Marcus felt something inside him crack open. They'd made it. Barely. The fire crew swarmed the plane immediately, dousing the smoking engine with foam. Marcus sat frozen in his seat, his entire body shaking. Rebecca was crying quietly in the galley. The co-pilot emerged from the cockpit, his face pale as paper. That was too close, the co-pilot said, his voice shaking. If we'd been over the ocean when that happened, if we'd been just 15 minutes further into the flight, we wouldn't have had anywhere to land. Marcus closed his eyes. 15 minutes. Emma had warned him. A 7-year-old girl in a purple jacket with scuffed sneakers had somehow known what trained engineers and experienced pilots hadn't detected. She had seen what should have been impossible to see, and he had walked away from her warning because she was nobody. Because her father cleaned toilets for a living. Because listening to them would have meant acknowledging that someone he considered beneath him might know something he didn't. When Marcus finally stepped off the plane, his legs barely holding him up, he made a decision. He pulled out his phone and called his assistant. Cancel the Singapore meeting. Reschedule it for next week. And I need you to find someone for me. A janitor at O'Hare Airport named David Miller. He has a daughter named Emma, about 7 years old. I need his contact information within the hour. His assistant, confused but efficient, promised to get it done. Marcus stood on the tarmac, watching the fire crew work on his damaged jet, and felt the weight of everything he'd become pressing down on him. He'd spent 20 years building walls around himself, and in 30 terrifying minutes, a child's warning had brought them crashing down. 2 hours later, Marcus found himself doing something he hadn't done in over a decade. He was standing in the employee break room of O'Hare Airport's maintenance section, surrounded by the smell of instant coffee and the hum of a struggling refrigerator. David Miller sat across from him at a plastic table covered in coffee rings, Emma beside him, swinging her legs and clutching a stuffed rabbit that had definitely seen better days. "I'm sorry for showing up like this," Marcus said, and he meant it. "I needed to see you both. To thank you." David looked uncomfortable, like he expected this to be some kind of joke or, worse, a lawsuit for harassment. "Thank us? Mr. Chen, I'm really sorry about this morning. Emma didn't mean any harm. She saved my life," Marcus said simply. The words felt heavy and true. "My plane had engine failure." Exactly like she said. "If I'd been over the ocean, I'd be dead right now." The color drained from David's face. Emma stopped swinging her legs and looked up at Marcus with those same serious eyes. "I told you," she said softly. "I saw it." Marcus leaned forward, his elbows on the cheap plastic table. "How did you know, Emma? How did you see it?" Emma shrugged, a child's gesture that belied the weight of what she was saying. "Sometimes I just know things. I see pictures in my head, like dreams but when I'm awake. Daddy says it's just my imagination, but it feels real. When I saw you at the gate, I saw the picture of your plane in the smoke and I knew I had to tell you." David put his arm around his daughter, protective and tender. "She's been like this since she was 3. She knew when my mother was going to die, told me 2 days before it happened. She knew when the apartment building next to ours was going to catch fire. We had to evacuate in the middle of the night, and the firefighters said if we'd been sleeping, we might not have made it out. But I can't explain it, Mr. Chen. Doctors say she's perfectly healthy. Psychologists say maybe she's just unusually perceptive, picks up on things other people miss. I don't know what to believe anymore." Marcus looked at Emma, really looked at her. This wasn't some mystical prophet or supernatural being. She was just a little girl who carried a gift she didn't ask for and probably didn't fully understand. And her father, this man who cleaned up other people's messes for minimum wage, loved her enough to let her be different, even when it made life harder. "You're a single father?" Marcus asked quietly. David nodded. "Emma's mom left when she was 2. Said she couldn't handle having a weird kid. That's what she called Emma." "Weird." Pain flickered across David's face. "It's been just the 2 of us since then. I work 3 jobs to keep us afloat. Janitor here during the day, night security at a warehouse, and weekend maintenance at a church. Emma stays with our neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, when I'm working. It's not perfect, but we manage." 3 jobs, Marcus repeated. He thought about his own life, his penthouse apartment overlooking the city, his collection of vintage cars, his closet full of suits that cost more than David probably made in a month. And you still found time to teach your daughter to tell the truth. To warn strangers about danger, even when you knew they'd think you were crazy. That's what good people do, David said simply. They try to help, even when it costs them something. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. When was the last time he'd helped someone without expecting something in return? When was the last time he'd seen a person rather than a transaction, a human being rather than an obstacle or an opportunity? Marcus stood up, his mind already racing with a plan that felt both crazy and absolutely necessary. David, Emma, I want to do something for you. Actually, I need to do something for you. Not because I owe you a debt, though I do, but because meeting you both has reminded me of something I forgot a long time ago. David looked wary. Mr. Chen, we don't need charity. It's not charity, Marcus said firmly. It's investment. Emma has a gift, something remarkable. She deserves to be in a place where that gift can be understood and developed, where she can learn to use it to help people. And you, David, you've been working yourself to exhaustion to give your daughter a chance. You deserve support, not struggle. Over the next hour, Marcus laid out a proposal that left both David and Emma speechless. He would establish a scholarship fund specifically for Emma, covering her education from now through university, at whatever school she chose. He would provide David with a position at Tech Vision Industries, not out of pity, but because Marcus genuinely needed people with David's work ethic and integrity in his company. The pay would be triple what David made now, with full benefits and reasonable hours so he could actually be present in his daughter's life. But more than that, Marcus wanted to create a research program, ethical and respectful, to understand gifts like Emma's. Not to exploit them, but to help children like her understand what they were experiencing and learn to live with abilities that set them apart. Emma wouldn't be a test subject. She would be a consultant, helping to design a program that could support other kids who saw things others couldn't. Why? David asked, his eyes shining with tears he was trying to hold back. Why would you do this for us? You don't even know us. Marcus thought about that morning at the gate. He thought about the contempt he'd felt, the annoyance at being interrupted by people he considered beneath him. He thought about the security guard approaching, the whispered judgments from other travelers, and the way he'd almost dismissed the most important warning of his life because of who it came from. Because this morning, I was going to die, Marcus said quietly. Not just physically, though that was close too. I was dying inside, and I didn't even know it. I'd become the kind of person who measures worth by bank accounts and job titles. The kind of person who walks away from a child trying to save his life because she's wearing a torn jacket and her father cleans floors. You both reminded me that wisdom doesn't come with a price tag, and courage doesn't require credentials. You reminded me what it means to be human. Emma climbed down from her chair and walked over to Marcus. She took his hand in her small one, looking up at him with those knowing eyes. You were lost, she said softly. But now you're finding your way back. I can see it. And in that moment, standing in a dingy break room at an airport, holding the hand of a child who had saved him in more ways than one, Marcus Chen felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years. He felt found. The weeks that followed transformed more than just David and Emma's lives. Marcus kept his word on every promise. David started his new position at Tech Vision Industries, working in their corporate social responsibility department, where his real-world perspective and genuine care for people proved invaluable. Emma enrolled in a private school that celebrated rather than pathologized her unique perceptions, with teachers who understood that different didn't mean wrong. But the bigger change was in Marcus himself. He started a foundation called Second Sight, dedicated to supporting children with unusual abilities and the families who love them. He partnered with neuroscientists, psychologists, and educators to create programs that approach these gifts with respect and curiosity rather than skepticism or exploitation. The story of Emma's warning and Marcus's near-death experience eventually leaked to the press. Some outlets treated it as a human interest story, others as evidence of psychic abilities, and still others as pure coincidence with a heartwarming ending. Marcus didn't care what people believed. He knew what he'd experienced, and he knew what mattered. 6 months after that Monday morning at Gate 47, Marcus stood before a crowd of 300 people at the opening ceremony of the Second Sight Center, a beautiful facility designed to feel more like a home than an institution. Emma and David sat in the front row, both wearing new clothes that Emma had picked out herself, insisting on purple because it was her power color. Marcus looked out at the crowd, which included journalists, scientists, families with children who'd been dismissed or misunderstood, and many of his own employees who'd volunteered to be part of this new initiative. He thought about the speech his PR team had written for him, full of corporate language and careful phrasing. Then he set it aside. 6 months ago, Marcus began, his voice steady and clear, I almost made the biggest mistake of my life. Actually, I'd been making it for 20 years. I'd convinced myself that success meant building walls, that power came from standing above others, and that listening to the wrong people could cost me everything. Then a 7-year-old girl in a purple jacket told me my plane was going to crash, and I walked away from her because she wasn't important enough to listen to. The room was silent. Marcus could see his board members shifting uncomfortably. This wasn't the carefully crafted image they'd approved. But for the first time in decades, Marcus didn't care what they thought. That plane did crash, or would have, if we'd been 15 minutes further from land when the engine failed. Emma Miller saved my life, not because she wanted anything from me, but because she believed in telling the truth and helping people, even when it cost her something. Her father, David, taught her that. A man working 3 jobs to keep a roof over his daughter's head taught her what I'd forgotten in my climate-controlled office and private jets. He taught her that being good matters more than being rich. That kindness is worth the risk of looking foolish. Marcus saw David wiping his eyes, Emma holding his hand tightly. He saw other parents in the audience nodding, recognizing their own struggles in David's story. He saw his assistant, who'd worked for him for 8 years, looking at him as if seeing him clearly for the first time. This center isn't about me trying to be a hero or buying redemption, Marcus continued. It's about making sure that children like Emma, children who see the world differently, who know things they shouldn't be able to know, who carry gifts that frighten and confuse the people around them, it's about making sure they never feel like they have to hide who they are. It's about supporting the parents who love them fiercely even when they don't understand. And it's about all of us learning to listen, really listen, especially to the voices we usually ignore. The applause started slowly, then built into something powerful and genuine. But Marcus wasn't done. He gestured for Emma to join him on the stage. She came up, still holding her father's hand, pulling David along with her. Emma, Marcus said, kneeling down so he was at her eye level. I want to ask you something in front of all these people. Will you be the first young consultant for the Second Sight Center? Will you help us understand what you experience, so we can help other kids like you? Emma looked at her father, who nodded encouragingly, tears streaming down his face. Then she looked back at Marcus with a smile that could light up a city. Yes, she said. But only if you promise to always listen, even when what I say sounds weird. I promise, Marcus said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. I will always listen. The crowd rose to their feet, applauding not just for the center or the generous funding Marcus had provided, but for the transformation they'd witnessed. The business news networks covered it extensively, though they focused more on Marcus's philanthropic pivot than on the deeper change that had occurred. But those who knew Marcus personally, his longtime employees and business partners, they saw the difference. The man who walked out of that ceremony was not the same man who'd stepped onto a doomed plane 6 months earlier. Marcus Chin had spent 20 years building an empire, but it took a janitor's daughter 30 seconds to teach him what real wealth looked like. It looked like integrity. It looked like courage. It looked like a father working 3 jobs because he loved his child more than he valued sleep. It looked like a little girl willing to be called crazy if it meant saving a stranger's life. In the end, the greatest shock wasn't that David Miller, the overlooked janitor, had raised an extraordinary daughter. The greatest shock was that a billionaire CEO had been humble enough to learn from them. That he'd been brave enough to admit he was wrong. that he'd been wise enough to understand that sometimes the people you dismiss hold the keys to the truths you most need to hear. And every time Marcus flew after that day, he thought of Emma's warning. He thought of how close he'd come to dying, not just in a plane crash, but in the slow, steady death of becoming someone who'd forgotten how to see people as people. Every time he made a business decision, he asked himself what David would do, what Emma would see if she looked at the situation with her clear, honest eyes. The world called it a redemption story. Marcus called it a wake-up call. But Emma, wise beyond her years, called it something else entirely. When a reporter asked her what she thought about the man whose life she'd saved, she simply said, "He was sleeping, but now he's awake." That's all. Sometimes people just need someone to believe in them enough to tell them the truth, even when it's scary. My daddy taught me that. And in those words, spoken by a child who'd been dismissed as weird, who'd been underestimated because of her father's job and her worn-out clothes, lay a wisdom that no amount of money could buy and no business degree could teach. The truth, offered with love, has the power to save lives in more ways than one. You just have to be brave enough to speak it, and humble enough to listen. The morning after the emergency landing, Marcus woke up in his penthouse apartment with a feeling he couldn't quite name. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Chicago's skyline, the same view he'd enjoyed for the past decade without really seeing it. Today, everything looked different. The buildings seemed smaller somehow, less impressive. The wealth that surrounded him, the marble countertops and designer furniture, the original artwork worth more than most people's homes, all of it felt hollow. He made coffee in his kitchen that cost more than a luxury car, and as he stood there waiting for the machine to finish its elaborate brewing process, his mind kept returning to that break room at the airport. The cracked plastic chairs. The flickering fluorescent lights. The instant coffee in styrofoam cups. And David Miller, sitting there with quiet dignity despite working 3 jobs just to survive, despite raising a daughter who saw things that scared people, despite every reason he had to be bitter about how life had treated him. Marcus had offered them help, yes, but as he stood in his kitchen that morning, he realized something uncomfortable. Part of him had made those offers expecting gratitude, expecting David and Emma to be overwhelmed with appreciation for his generosity. He'd expected them to see him as their savior, the wealthy benefactor descending from on high to rescue them from their struggles. But that's not what had happened at all. David had listened to every proposal with careful consideration, asking thoughtful questions about the implications for Emma's privacy, about the expectations that would come with accepting help, about whether this was truly about supporting his daughter or about Marcus needing to feel better about himself. Those questions had stung because they were fair. They were the questions of a man who understood that nothing in life was truly free, that every gift came with strings, and that protecting his daughter mattered more than accepting charity from a guilty billionaire. And Emma, she'd looked at Marcus with those knowing eyes and said something that had kept him awake most of the night. "You feel bad because you were mean to us. But feeling bad isn't the same as being different. Are you going to be different now, or are you just going to feel bad and then go back to being the same?" 7 years old, and she'd cut straight to the heart of it. Marcus had built a career on being the smartest person in every room, on seeing angles and opportunities that others missed. But this child had seen through him in seconds, had identified the question he was afraid to ask himself. Was this real change, or was it just guilt that would fade once the shock of almost dying wore off? His phone buzzed with messages. His assistant had sent him the revised schedule for the Singapore meeting, now pushed back 2 weeks. His board members were asking questions about why he'd delayed such a crucial negotiation. His lawyer wanted to discuss the liability issues around the plane malfunction. His publicist was fielding calls from news outlets who'd gotten word of the emergency landing and wanted statements. The machine of his life was humming along as always, pulling him back toward the person he'd been yesterday. But Marcus made a decision that surprised even himself. He ignored all of it. Instead, he called his assistant and told her to clear his entire schedule for the week. Then he got dressed, not in one of his tailored suits, but in jeans and a simple shirt, and he drove himself to a neighborhood he'd never visited before. The address his assistant had found for David Miller led Marcus to a part of Chicago that rarely appeared in the glossy magazines that featured his penthouse. The apartment building was old but well-maintained, the kind of place where people took pride in what little they had. Children's bikes were chained to the railings. Window boxes held flowers that someone had planted and actually remembered to water. A group of elderly residents sat on the front steps, enjoying the morning sun and watching the neighborhood wake up. They eyed Marcus with open suspicion as he approached. His car, even though it was one of his more modest vehicles, still screamed wealth and didn't belong on this street. His clothes might have been casual for him, but the quality was obvious. He was clearly out of place, and everyone knew it. "Help you with something?" An older woman asked, her tone polite but guarded. "I'm looking for David Miller," Marcus said. "He and his daughter Emma, they helped me yesterday, and I wanted to follow up with them." "David's at work," another resident said. "Won't be back until evening. Works himself half to death, that man. Good father, though. Best neighbor you could ask for." "And little Emma?" An elderly man added. "That girl's special. Sees things. Told Mrs. Patterson to get her heart checked 2 months ago, said she saw something wrong. Sure enough, doctors found a blockage. Surgery saved her life. People around here, we know Emma's gift is real, even if outsiders think we're crazy." Marcus felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't just a struggling single father and his unusual daughter. This was a community that valued them, that recognized Emma's abilities as a gift rather than a problem, that supported David even when he was stretched impossibly thin. These people, with their modest incomes and aging apartment building, had created something Marcus had never managed to build with all his wealth. They'd created a place where people mattered more than money. "I'm Marcus Chen," he said, deciding that honesty was the only way forward. "Emma warned me yesterday that my plane was going to crash. She was right. It did. Well, it nearly did. Engine failure shortly after takeoff. If we'd been further from the airport, I wouldn't be standing here." The suspicion in their eyes shifted to something else. Understanding, maybe. Or recognition that Marcus was being genuine. "That sounds like our Emma," the first woman said, her expression softening. "Child's been blessed with sight since she could talk. Blessing and a burden, if you ask me. Hard being different, especially for a little one. But David's raised her right. Taught her to use her gift to help people, not to show off or scare folks. You're lucky she spoke up for you." "I am," Marcus agreed. "More lucky than I deserve to be. I didn't listen at first. Almost didn't listen at all." The elderly man studying him nodded slowly. "But you did listen, eventually. That counts for something. Most folks in your position, they'd have walked away and never looked back, even after the plane trouble. Pride's a powerful thing. Takes real strength to admit you were wrong." Marcus spent the next hour sitting on those front steps with David and Emma's neighbors, listening to stories about the community. He learned that David had lived in this building for 5 years, that he'd organized a neighborhood watch program and helped elderly residents with repairs they couldn't afford. He learned that Emma had predicted a water main break that saved the building from flooding, that she'd warned a teenager not to take a specific route home one night, and that teenager had later learned there'd been a mugging on that exact street at that exact time. He learned that when David's former wife had abandoned them, calling Emma a freak and saying she couldn't handle raising a weird child, it had been this community that had wrapped around them like armor. Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who watched Emma during David's long work hours, refused to take payment. The local grocer sometimes slipped extra food into David's bags when he thought no one was watching. The landlord, who owned the building, had kept their rent stable for years, never raising it despite the neighborhood slowly gentrifying around them. "People here understand something that folks in fancy towers forget," Mrs. Patterson said. She joined the conversation, bringing out lemonade in mismatched glasses. "We understand that we're all we've got. Money comes and goes, but community, real community, that's what keeps you alive. David and Emma, they're part of our family, we take care of our own." Marcus thought about his own building, where he'd lived for 10 years and couldn't name a single neighbor. Where people rode elevators in silence, eyes on their phones, treating each other like inconvenient obstacles rather than fellow human beings. He thought that privacy was a luxury, that not having to interact with neighbors was a sign of success. But sitting here on these worn steps, drinking lukewarm lemonade from a glass with cartoon characters on it, he realized he'd been living in isolation and calling it achievement. His phone buzzed again. His board chair was calling, probably irritated about the delayed meeting. Marcus looked at the screen, then deliberately put the phone in his pocket without answering. For the first time in 20 years, something mattered more than business. "Would it be all right if I waited for David?" Marcus asked. "I know I'm intruding, and I have no right to take up your time, but I'd really like to speak with him again. With Emma too, if that's okay." The neighbors exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, Mrs. Patterson nodded. "David gets home around 6. Emma gets back from school at 3:30. You're welcome to wait, but I'm warning you now, if you're here to cause them trouble or to make some kind of spectacle out of Emma's gift, you'll answer to all of us. That little girl's been through enough with people trying to exploit her or calling her crazy. She doesn't need some rich man treating her like a curiosity." "I understand," Marcus said. "And I give you my word, that's not why I'm here. I'm here because they showed me something I'd forgotten, and I need to understand it better. I need to understand how to be better." The elderly man who'd spoken earlier studied Marcus for a long moment, then smiled slightly. "Well, that's a start at least. Come on, then. Mrs. Patterson makes the best sandwiches in the building. You look like you could use some real food instead of whatever fancy nonsense rich folks eat." Marcus found himself following Mrs. Patterson into her apartment, which was small and cluttered with a lifetime of memories. Photos covered every surface, showing children and grandchildren, celebrations and ordinary moments elevated to treasure by love and time. The furniture was old but comfortable, the kind that molded to your body because it had been sat in by generations of family. Everything in the space had a story, a history, a connection to something beyond mere function. Mrs. Patterson moved around her tiny kitchen with practiced efficiency, pulling out bread in cold cuts, slicing tomatoes from a plant on her windowsill. "Emma helps me water that tomato plant," she said, noticing Marcus looking at it. "Every day after school, first thing she does is come check on it. Talks to it sometimes, tells it about her day. Says plants have feelings too, that they grow better when they know someone cares." "Does Emma see things about plants too?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious. "Like she sees things about people?" "Sometimes," Mrs. Patterson said, spreading mayonnaise on bread with the careful precision of someone who'd made thousands of sandwiches. "Mostly with living things. She knew my cat was sick before the vet confirmed it. She told the family upstairs that their baby was going to arrive early, and sure enough, little Michael came 3 weeks ahead of schedule. It's not like she sees the future exactly, or at least that's how David explained it to me. It's more like she sees things as they really are, underneath all the pretending and hiding we humans do. She sees the truth of situations, the reality that most of us miss because we're too busy looking at the surface." Marcus accepted the sandwich Mrs. Patterson handed him, and when he bit into it, he was surprised by how good it tasted. Simple ingredients, nothing fancy, but made with care and served with genuine hospitality. It was better than most of the expensive meals he'd eaten in Michelin-starred restaurants. "You look surprised," Mrs. Patterson said, a knowing smile on her weathered face. "Good food doesn't require fancy ingredients, Mr. Chen. It requires attention and care. Same as raising children, same as building community, same as living a good life. The basics done well matter more than expensive complications." They sat at her small kitchen table, and Marcus found himself talking in a way he hadn't talked to anyone in years. He told her about his parents, about losing them young and feeling adrift in a world that seemed designed to grind down people like him. He told her about building his company from nothing, about the satisfaction of success and the emptiness that had somehow grown alongside it. He told her about standing at that gate yesterday, looking down at Emma, and feeling nothing but irritation at the interruption. The worst part, Marcus said, surprising himself with his honesty, is that I was proud of that reaction. I thought it showed strength, that I couldn't be swayed by emotional appeals or distracted from my goals. I thought dismissing them proved I was focused, disciplined, above getting pulled into other people's drama. Mrs. Patterson listened without judgment, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. When Marcus finished, she was quiet for a moment, then said, "My husband died 15 years ago. Heart attack, sudden and cruel. We'd been married 42 years, and I thought I'd die from the grief of losing him. But you know what saved me? This community. People showing up with casseroles I didn't eat and company I didn't think I wanted. People who saw me struggling and didn't wait for me to ask for help, just showed up and helped." She paused, looking out her window at the neighborhood she'd lived in for decades. "I learned something from that experience, Mr. Chen. I learned that strength isn't about standing alone. Real strength is about having the courage to be connected, to let yourself need people and to let them need you. Your walls might feel like protection, but really they're prison bars. Emma and David, they don't have walls. They're open to the world, vulnerable to being hurt, and yes, that's scary. But it also means they're open to love, to community, to the kind of life that actually means something." Marcus felt something crack inside him, some calcified part of his heart that had been hardened by years of defending himself against a world he decided was hostile. "I don't know how to do that," he admitted. "I don't know how to be open like that. I've spent so long building defenses, I'm not sure I remember what it feels like to be without them." "Then you learn," Mrs. Patterson said simply. "Same way Emma's learning to live with her gift, same way David learned to be both mother and father to his daughter. You learn by trying, by failing, by trying again. And you let people help you, which is maybe the hardest lesson of all for someone like you." The afternoon passed in a way Marcus couldn't have predicted. More neighbors stopped by, some curious about the stranger in Mrs. Patterson's apartment, others bringing food or small items they'd borrowed and were returning. Each person had a story about David and Emma, about small kindnesses and quiet heroism that never made the news but changed lives nonetheless. There was Carlos from the second floor, who talked about how David had helped him study for his citizenship test, spending hours after his own exhausting shifts to help a neighbor achieve a dream. There was young G, who'd just started college, who said Emma had somehow known she was struggling with depression and had left little drawings under her door every day for a month, pictures of sunshine and flowers with messages like "You matter" and "Tomorrow will be better." There was Mr. Henderson, retired and lonely, who said David checked on him every single day without fail, making sure he'd eaten and had his medications, treating him with the respect and dignity his own children couldn't be bothered to provide. These weren't grand gestures or headline-worthy acts of charity. They were the everyday choices of people who decided that kindness mattered more than convenience, that community was worth the effort, that showing up for each other was simply what humans were supposed to do. Marcus thought about his own life, about the charitable donations his accountant recommended for tax purposes, about the galas he attended where wealthy people congratulated each other for their generosity while never actually interacting with the people they claimed to help. He thought about the distance he'd maintained from anything messy or complicated, the way he'd structured his entire existence to avoid the kind of entanglement he was witnessing here. At 3:30, the building's front door burst open, and Marcus heard Emma's voice echoing through the halls. "Mrs. Patterson. I got a gold star on my science project. And Miss Rodriguez said my presentation was the best in the class." The little girl appeared in the doorway, still wearing her backpack, her face flushed with excitement. She stopped when she saw Marcus, her expression shifting from joy to something more measured, more knowing. "You came back," Emma said. It wasn't a question. "I did," Marcus confirmed. "I wanted to talk to you and your father again. To thank you properly. And to ask if we could talk more about my offer from yesterday." Emma came into the apartment, carefully taking off her backpack and setting it by the door the way she'd clearly been taught. She accepted the juice box Mrs. Patterson offered her and sat down at the table across from Marcus, studying him with those unsettling, penetrating eyes. "You're different today," Emma said after a moment. "Yesterday you were all closed up, like a box with the lid shut tight. Today you're more open. I can see inside a little bit. What do you see? Marcus asked, genuinely wanting to know. Emma took a sip of her juice, considering. You're scared. Not of dying in a plane, but of being wrong. Of having wasted time. Of being alone even though you have lots of money. And you're hoping that helping me and Daddy will make you feel less alone, but you're worried that nothing will work, that you're too broken to fix. The accuracy of her assessment took Marcus's breath away. He'd spent thousands of dollars on therapists over the years, none of whom had gotten this close to the truth this quickly. That's exactly right, he said quietly. How do you do that, Emma? How do you see so clearly? I don't know, Emma said with a child's simple honesty. I just do. Daddy says everyone can do it if they practice, that most people just forget how because they stop paying attention. He says adults get so busy thinking about what they want to see that they forget to look at what's actually there. Before Marcus could respond, David Miller walked through the door, still wearing his janitor's uniform, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. He stopped when he saw Marcus, surprise and something that might have been weariness crossing his face. Mr. Chen, David said carefully. I wasn't expecting to see you here. I hope it's okay that I came, Marcus said, standing up. I wanted to talk to you again. To make sure you understood that my offer yesterday was genuine, and to better understand what would actually help you and Emma rather than just assuming I know what you need. David looked at his daughter, then at Mrs. Patterson, then back at Marcus. Let me change out of this uniform and get something to eat. Then we can talk. Emma, homework first, then you can watch your show. But Daddy, I want to hear what Mr. Chen has to say, Emma protested. Homework, David repeated firmly, but with love. This is adult conversation, sweetheart. If there's anything you need to know, I'll tell you afterward. Emma sighed dramatically but obeyed, retrieving her backpack and settling at the table with her books. David disappeared into what must have been their bedroom, and Marcus waited, feeling the weight of what was about to happen. This wasn't a boardroom negotiation where he could use leverage and strategy. This was something real, something that required a different kind of courage than he was used to needing. When David returned, dressed in worn jeans and a faded shirt, they moved to Mrs. Patterson's living room. The older woman made herself scarce, claiming she needed to check on something upstairs, leaving them with privacy but also with Emma nearby, her presence a reminder of what this was really about. Mr. Chen, David began, his voice measured and careful, I appreciate what you said yesterday. I really do. But I need you to understand something. Emma and we've had people make promises before. Well-meaning people who said they wanted to help, who were inspired by Emma's gift or moved by our situation. And every single one of them disappeared when they realized that helping actually required sustained effort, that we weren't going to be grateful forever, that Emma's gift comes with complications they didn't sign up for. David's hands were clasped together, knuckles white with tension. I've had researchers who wanted to study Emma like she was a lab rat. I've had religious people who wanted to use her as proof of their beliefs. I've had skeptics who wanted to expose her as a fraud. And I've had wealthy benefactors who wanted to feel good about themselves by rescuing the poor janitor and his weird kid. Every single one of them saw us as a means to an end, not as actual human beings. Marcus felt each word like a physical blow, recognizing himself in that description more than he wanted to admit. You're right to be cautious, he said. And I can't promise I won't let you down, because I probably will at some point. I'm still figuring out how to be the kind of person who doesn't let people down. But I can promise that I'm trying, genuinely trying, to understand what actually helping looks like rather than what makes me feel better about myself. Why? David asked bluntly. You're a billionaire with a company to run and a life most people can only dream about. Why do you care about a janitor and his daughter? Guilt only goes so far, Mr. Chen. Eventually you'll go back to your real life, and will be a story you tell at dinner parties about the time you almost died and learned an important lesson. The challenge in David's voice was clear, and Marcus respected him for it. This was a man who'd been disappointed too many times to accept easy promises and surface-level commitment. You want the truth? Marcus asked. The real truth? That's all I ever want, David said. Marcus took a deep breath. Yesterday, when Emma warned me about the plane, I felt contempt. Not just dismissal or annoyance, but actual contempt for both of you. I saw your uniform and your daughter's torn jacket and I made a judgment about your worth as human beings. I decided in less than 5 seconds that nothing you had to say could possibly matter to me because of who you were and what you represented. He saw David's jaw tighten, but he continued. Then the plane failed, exactly like Emma said it would, and I had 30 minutes of pure terror where I thought I was going to die. And in those 30 minutes, all I could think about was how empty my life was. How I'd spent 20 years building something impressive and forgotten to build something meaningful. How I'd surrounded myself with expensive things and isolated myself from actual human connection. Marcus leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, meeting David's eyes directly. When I came to find you yesterday, part of it was guilt, you're right about that. But the bigger part was desperation. I saw in you and Emma something I don't have and don't know how to get. I saw genuine purpose, real connection, the kind of love and commitment that can't be bought or manufactured. And I realized that all my success means nothing if I die alone in a penthouse surrounded by things instead of people. The room was quiet except for the sound of Emma's pencil scratching across her homework paper. David studied Marcus for a long moment, his expression unreadable. So you want to buy your way into what we have, David finally said. You want to invest in us so you can feel like you're part of something real. No, Marcus said. I mean, maybe, partly. But more than that, I want to learn how to be different. And I think helping you and Emma, really helping in ways that you define as helpful rather than ways that make me feel good, that might be how I start learning. I'm not asking to be your friend or to become part of your community. I'm asking for a chance to do something that matters, even if I screw it up sometimes. David was quiet for another long moment. Then he said, Emma, come here please. The little girl put down her pencil and came over, climbing into her father's lap with the ease of a child who knows she's loved absolutely. David wrapped his arms around her, and Marcus felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Envy, maybe. Or grief for something he'd never had. What do you think, sweetheart? David asked his daughter. You're the one with the sight. Is Mr. Chen telling the truth? Can we trust him? Emma looked at Marcus with those knowing eyes, and he felt completely exposed, like she was reading every secret he'd ever kept, every failure he'd ever hidden. It was terrifying and somehow liberating at the same time. He's telling the truth about wanting to change, Emma said slowly. But he doesn't know how yet. He's going to make mistakes and sometimes he's going to fall back into being the old Mr. Chen, the one who thinks money fixes everything. But his heart is starting to wake up. It's like it's been asleep for a really long time, and now it's starting to remember what it's supposed to do. She tilted her head, still studying him. We should help him, Daddy. Not because he's rich or because he wants to help us. We should help him because he saved his own life yesterday by listening, and that means he can learn. People who can learn can change. And people who change can matter. David's eyes filled with tears, and he pressed a kiss to the top of his daughter's head. You're so much wiser than any 7-year-old should have to be, he murmured. Then he looked at Marcus. All right. We'll accept your help. But on conditions. Name them, Marcus said immediately. First, Emma's privacy and well-being come before everything. Any program or research or whatever you want to set up, she has veto power. If she's uncomfortable, we stop, no questions asked. Second, this isn't about you getting credit or feeling good about yourself. You don't get to use our story for publicity or to improve your image. Third, you actually show up. Not just with money, but with your time and presence. If you're going to be part of our lives, then be part of our lives, not just a distant benefactor. David's voice was firm, the voice of a father protecting his child. And fourth, you let us help you too. This isn't a one-way street where you're the hero rescuing the poor people. You need what we have as much as we need what you have. So you be honest with us, you let us see your struggles, and you accept that sometimes a janitor and his 7-year-old daughter might understand things you don't. Can you do that? Marcus felt something shift inside him, like a door opening after being locked for decades. These weren't the conditions of someone asking for charity. These were the conditions of equals entering into partnership, of people who understood that real relationships required vulnerability and mutual respect. "Yes," Marcus said, and his voice was thick with emotion he didn't bother trying to hide. "I can do that. I want to do that." Emma smiled, a bright, genuine smile that transformed her serious face into something radiant. "Good," she said. "Because you're going to need a lot of help, Mr. Chen. Being a better person is really hard work. Way harder than making money." David laughed, a sound of relief and residual fear and hope all tangled together. "Out of the mouths of babes," he said. Then he extended his hand to Marcus. "All right then. Partners. Equals. Friends, maybe, if we all survive this." Marcus took his hand, feeling the calluses from years of hard labor, the strength of a man who'd never had the luxury of giving up. "Partners," he agreed. "And I'm going to try really hard not to let you down." "You will let us down sometimes," Emma said matter-of-factly. "Everyone does. But Daddy says what matters isn't never making mistakes, it's what you do after you make them. So when you mess up, and you will, you just have to own it and try to do better next time." 7 years old, Marcus thought again, and teaching lessons that business schools couldn't capture. He stayed for dinner that evening, eating spaghetti at a small table in David and Emma's modest apartment, listening to Emma talk about her school day and David share stories about his various jobs. It was the most ordinary evening Marcus had spent in 20 years, and it was also the most extraordinary. As he drove home that night, his phone full of urgent messages he still hadn't answered, Marcus realized something fundamental had shifted. The life he'd built, the empire he'd created, all of it suddenly seemed negotiable in a way it never had before. Success, he was beginning to understand, might mean something entirely different than he'd thought. And for the first time in 2 decades, he felt something that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. He felt hopeful that change was actually possible, that he wasn't trapped forever in the person he'd become, that maybe, just maybe, a janitor's daughter in a purple jacket had saved more than just his life. Maybe she'd saved his soul too. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Marcus discovered that transformation was messier than he'd anticipated. He'd restructured David's employment contract, setting him up in a position that utilized his actual skills rather than just his willingness to clean. The job was in community outreach, connecting Tech Vision's resources with neighborhoods that needed technology access and education. David had a natural gift for understanding what people actually needed versus what corporations thought they needed, and within days, he'd identified gaps in Marcus's philanthropic strategy that entire consulting firms had missed. Emma had started at Riverside Academy, a progressive private school where her unique perceptions were treated as an asset rather than a liability. The principal, Dr. Sarah Okonkwo, had worked with gifted children for 30 years and understood that intelligence came in forms that standardized tests couldn't measure. Emma thrived there, making friends with other kids who thought differently, who saw patterns and connections that conventional education systems tried to stamp out in favor of conformity. But success in one area had illuminated failures in others, and Marcus was facing the consequences of decades of prioritizing profit over people. His board of directors had called an emergency meeting, and the atmosphere in the conference room was arctic. 12 faces stared at him across the mahogany table, expressions ranging from confusion to barely concealed hostility. "Let me understand this correctly," Richard Ashford said, his voice dripping with condescension. Richard was old money, inherited wealth that gave him the confidence of someone who'd never had to actually build anything. "You've delayed the Singapore merger, our biggest deal of the year, because you almost died in a plane crash and now you're having some kind of midlife crisis?" "That's a reductive interpretation," Marcus replied, keeping his voice level even as anger simmered beneath the surface. "I delayed the merger because I needed to ensure our company's foundation was solid before expanding internationally. We've been growing too fast without considering the human cost." "The human cost?" Margaret Winters laughed, sharp and humorless. She was the board's financial hawk, brilliant with numbers and utterly indifferent to anything that couldn't be quantified in a spreadsheet. "Marcus, We're a technology company, not a charity. Our responsibility is to shareholders, not to feel-good initiatives that don't generate revenue. Marcus had anticipated this resistance, but hearing it stated so baldly still hit him like a physical blow. These were people he'd worked with for years, people he'd chosen for the board because they shared his vision of aggressive growth and market dominance. Except now he was realizing that vision had been hollow, impressive on paper but empty of actual purpose. Our responsibility, Marcus said carefully, is to build something sustainable. And sustainability requires more than quarterly earnings. It requires investing in communities, supporting employees beyond minimum legal requirements, and acknowledging that our success is built on the labor of people who deserve more than we've been giving them. This is about that janitor, isn't it? Thomas Park leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. The one whose kid supposedly predicted your plane crash. Marcus, I don't know what kind of con they're running, but you're being manipulated. Poor single father, psychic daughter, it's a classic sob story designed to separate wealthy men from their money. Something cold and sharp formed in Marcus's chest. David Miller isn't conning anyone. His daughter saved my life. And what I choose to do with my money and my company is my decision, not yours. Actually, Richard interjected, it's not just your decision anymore. You gave us board seats specifically to provide oversight, to prevent emotional decision-making from damaging the company. And that's exactly what's happening here. You're making irrational choices based on survivors' guilt and misplaced gratitude. The meeting deteriorated from there. Marcus presented the community investment programs he wanted to implement, initiatives that would cost money up front but build long-term loyalty and stability. The board shot down every proposal, citing fiduciary responsibility and shareholder expectations. They questioned his judgment, suggested he take a leave of absence, and hinted that if he continued down this path, they'd have to consider whether he was fit to lead the company he'd built. Marcus left the meeting feeling hollowed out and furious. He'd spent 20 years building Tech Vision, poured everything he had into making it successful, and now the very people he'd empowered were telling him he couldn't use that success to do something meaningful. He sat in his office afterward, staring at the city below, and felt the familiar pull of old patterns. It would be easier to give in, to go back to focusing purely on profit, to keep David and Emma in a separate box labeled personal philanthropy while running his business the way he always had. His phone rang. It was David. Hey, David's voice was tight with stress. Do you have a minute? Something's happened. Marcus was at the apartment building within 30 minutes, taking the stairs two at a time because waiting for the elevator felt impossible. He found David's door open, voices spilling into the hallway. Inside, Emma sat on the couch, her face streaked with tears, while Mrs. Patterson held her hand and murmured comfort. David paced the small living room like a caged animal, phone pressed to his ear, his free hand clenched into a fist. I understand that, but she's 7 years old, David was saying, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. She doesn't understand why people are saying these things about her. Yes, I'll call you back. He ended the call and saw Marcus standing in the doorway. Something in David's expression crumbled. The media found out. About Emma warning you, about the plane. Someone leaked it, and now it's everywhere. News outlets, social media, everyone's got an opinion about whether she's gifted or disturbed, whether we're exploiting her or you're exploiting us. There are reporters outside the building. One of them followed Emma home from school, asking her questions, trying to get her to prove her abilities. Marcus felt ice flood his veins. They followed her from school? A 7-year-old child? Her principal called me, furious, David said. Said a man with a camera tried to get onto school grounds, claiming he was doing a story about gifted children. Security stopped him, but Emma saw him. She knew why he was there. It terrified her. Marcus looked at Emma, curled into Mrs. Patterson's side, her small body shaking with sobs. This was his fault. He'd been so focused on his own transformation, on learning to be better, that he hadn't considered the consequences for the people he was trying to help. The publicity, the attention, all of it stemmed from his position and his near-death experience becoming public knowledge. I'm so sorry, Marcus said, and his voice cracked. This is my fault. I should have protected you better. I should have anticipated this. It's not your fault, David said, but there was exhaustion in his voice. Or maybe it is, I don't know anymore. All I know is that Emma's gift, the thing that makes her special and lets her help people, it's being turned into entertainment. People are treating her like a circus act, and I don't know how to protect her from that. Emma lifted her head, her eyes red and puffy. They called me a freak at school today. Not the kids, they're nice. But I heard teachers talking in the hallway. They said I was disturbed, that Daddy should get me psychiatric help, that letting me think I have special powers is child abuse. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Am I crazy, Mr. Chen? Did I really see your plane crash, or am I just weird like Mommy said? Marcus crossed the room and knelt in front of Emma, his heart breaking. You are not crazy. You are not weird. You saw something real, and you were brave enough to speak up even though you knew people might not believe you. That makes you extraordinary, Emma. Not disturbed. Not a freak. Extraordinary. But everyone's looking at me now, Emma whispered. And not in a good way. They look at me like I'm something wrong, something broken. I don't want to be special anymore. I just want to be normal. David sank onto the couch beside his daughter, pulling her close. He looked at Marcus over Emma's head, and in his eyes was a question Marcus understood without words being spoken. Was this worth it? Was Marcus's journey toward becoming a better person worth the cost it was extracting from this child? I can make this stop, Marcus said quietly. I can issue a statement saying the plane crash story was exaggerated, that Emma's warning was coincidence blown out of proportion. I can redirect the attention back to me and away from both of you. It won't erase what's already out there, but it might calm things down. That means lying, Emma said, her voice small but clear. You said we should always tell the truth. Sometimes, David said gently, protecting people we love matters more than being right. If Mr. Chen saying it was coincidence makes the reporters leave you alone, maybe that's the truth we need right now. Emma was quiet for a long moment, thinking with that peculiar intensity she brought to everything. Finally, she shook her head. No. If we lie, it means they win. It means the people who think I'm broken get to decide what's true. I don't want that. Baby, you're 7, David said, his voice thick with emotion. You shouldn't have to fight this battle. But I am fighting it, Emma said. Every day at school, every time someone looks at me weird, I'm already fighting it. At least if we tell the truth, I'm fighting for something real instead of just trying to hide. Marcus felt humbled by this child's courage, shamed by his own board's cowardice and by his decades of taking the easy path. Then we tell the truth, he said. And we do it in a way that protects you as much as possible. I'll hold a press conference, explain what happened, and make it clear that anyone who harasses you or your father will face legal consequences. I'll use every resource I have to create a barrier between you and the people who want to exploit this. That'll make your board even angrier, David said. It wasn't a question. I don't care, Marcus replied, and as he said it, he realized it was true. They're already angry. They think I'm having a breakdown, that I'm being manipulated, that I've lost sight of what matters. Maybe they're right about that last part, but not in the way they think. I did lose sight of what matters, years ago. I'm just now starting to find it again. The press conference Marcus called for the following morning was unlike anything he'd done before. Usually, his public appearances were carefully orchestrated, every word scripted by PR professionals, every question anticipated and rehearsed. This time, he walked into the conference room at Tech Vision headquarters with nothing but the truth and a fierce determination to protect the people who'd shown him what truth looked like. The room was packed with reporters, cameras, and the kind of feeding frenzy that accompanies any story involving wealth, near-death experiences, and children with unusual abilities. Marcus saw his board members standing at the back, their expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed fury. He saw his lawyer, who'd begged him not to do this without legal review. And in the front row, he saw David and Emma, sitting with Mrs. Patterson and flanked by security he'd hired to ensure their safety. Marcus stepped up to the podium and looked directly into the cameras. 3 weeks ago, my private jet experienced catastrophic engine failure shortly after takeoff. The pilots managed to land the plane safely, but if the failure had occurred 15 minutes later, when we were over Lake Michigan, I would not be standing here today. That is not speculation. That is fact, confirmed by aviation experts and safety investigators. He paused, letting that sink in. 30 minutes before I boarded that plane, a 7-year-old girl named Emma Miller approached me at the airport gate and told me my plane was going to crash. She described engine trouble over the ocean, specific enough that when it actually happened, I couldn't dismiss it as coincidence or lucky guessing. Emma Miller saved my life. The reporters erupted with questions, but Marcus held up his hand. I'm not taking questions yet. You're going to listen first, because this story matters more than your headlines. The room quieted, shocked by his bluntness. Marcus continued, his voice steady. Emma didn't ask for publicity. She didn't want attention or reward. She's a child who saw danger and tried to warn someone, the way any decent human being should. And instead of being thanked, instead of being protected, she's been harassed, followed, called disturbed, and exploited. Grown adults have frightened a 7-year-old child because they want a story or because they can't accept that sometimes the world contains things they don't understand. Marcus's hands gripped the podium. Let me be absolutely clear. Emma Miller and her father David are under my protection. Anyone who harasses them, follows them, attempts to exploit them for content or profit, will face the full weight of my legal and financial resources. I don't care if you're a reporter, a researcher, or just someone with a camera phone and too much time. Leave them alone. But Mr. Chen, a reporter called out, surely you understand the public interest in this story. If Emma Miller really has precognitive abilities, that's a matter of scientific importance. Emma Miller is a child, not a research subject, Marcus shot back. Her well-being is more important than satisfying your curiosity. And frankly, the fact that so many of you can't see that says more about what's wrong with our society than anything else. He softened his tone slightly. I'm establishing a foundation to support children like Emma, children whose abilities or perspectives don't fit into conventional categories. This foundation will provide educational opportunities, psychological support, and protection from exploitation. It will be run by experts in child development and ethics, not by people looking to prove or disprove the existence of psychic abilities. Because that's not the point. Marcus looked directly at Emma, who was watching him with those knowing eyes. The point is that Emma Miller is a brave, kind, extraordinary little girl who deserves to have a childhood. Who deserves to go to school without being followed by cameras? Who deserves to use her gifts to help people without being treated like a carnival attraction? And I'm going to make sure she gets that, no matter what it costs me. The questions came then, rapid fire and aggressive. Reporters wanted to know if Marcus was being conned, if he'd lost his mind, if this was a publicity stunt for some new tech vision product. Financial journalists wanted to know how his board felt about him using company resources for personal pet projects. Skeptics demanded proof, wanted Emma to demonstrate her abilities, suggested the whole thing was an elaborate hoax. Marcus answered each question with patient firmness, never wavering from his central message. Emma was not a spectacle. Her privacy mattered. And anyone who couldn't respect that could leave. When it was over, when the reporters had been ushered out and the room had cleared, Marcus found himself alone with David, Emma, and the disapproving stares of his board members. Richard Ashford approached, his face red with suppressed anger. That was professional suicide, Richard said flatly. You just told the entire business world that you're more interested in playing guardian angel than in running your company. Shareholders will revolt. Investors will pull out. You've made yourself look unstable, Marcus. Then they'll pull out, Marcus said, surprised by how calm he felt. And I'll find new investors who actually care about building something meaningful. This is insane, Margaret Winters added. You're throwing away everything you've built for a janitor and his daughter. Do you understand what you're risking? Marcus looked at Emma, who was holding her father's hand, and then at David, whose eyes were bright with unshed tears. He thought about the board meeting yesterday, about the cold calculation that reduced human beings to line items in a budget. He thought about his empty penthouse and his empty life, about 20 years of success that had left him hollow. I understand exactly what I'm risking, Marcus said quietly. And for the first time in 2 decades, I'm okay with that. Because the alternative is going back to being the person I was 3 weeks ago, and I'd rather lose everything than become him again. Richard shook his head in disgust. You'll regret this. When your company collapses and your reputation is destroyed, you'll regret choosing them over everything you worked for. Maybe, Marcus acknowledged. But I've spent 20 years regretting who I became while building that empire. I'd rather regret trying to be better than regret never trying at all. The board members left, their silence more damning than any words could have been. Marcus knew that emergency meetings were probably already being scheduled, that conversations about removing him from his own company were likely happening before they'd even left the building. He'd just burned bridges he'd spent decades building, and the cost would be catastrophic. But as Emma came over and slipped her small hand into his, looking up at him with a smile that held no judgment and no expectation, just pure acceptance, Marcus felt something he'd been missing for longer than he could remember. He felt peace. The kind that comes from finally choosing right over easy, from prioritizing people over profit, from accepting that being vulnerable and human mattered more than being powerful and untouchable. Thank you, Emma said simply. For telling the truth even though it was scary. You're welcome, Marcus replied, squeezing her hand gently. Though I should be thanking you. Again. You keep saving me, Emma. Not just from plane crashes, but from myself. David put his hand on Marcus's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity and support. You know your board's probably going to try to force you out, right? This kind of public stand, it has consequences. I know, Marcus said. And we'll deal with those consequences when they come. Together, if you're willing. Together, David agreed. Though I have to warn you, being on our side doesn't come with the same perks as being a billionaire CEO. We can't offer you much beyond friendship and the occasional home-cooked meal. Marcus smiled, genuine and unforced. That sounds like more than I've had in 20 years. I'll take it. As they left the building together, walking past the remaining reporters and the curiosity seekers drawn by the spectacle, Marcus felt the weight of what he'd done settle over him. He'd just bet his entire career, his reputation, and his financial empire on the belief that being true to himself mattered more than protecting what he'd built. It was reckless and possibly foolish, and his accountants would be having simultaneous heart attacks when they heard about it. But as Emma skipped between him and David, chattering about a project she was working on at school, as Mrs. Patterson walked beside them offering commentary on the ridiculousness of reporters and the importance of standing by your principles, Marcus realized something profound. For the first time since his parents died, for the first time since he'd decided that being powerful meant being alone, he wasn't walking through life isolated and defended. He was walking through it connected, vulnerable, and somehow stronger for it. The old Marcus would have called that weakness. The new Marcus, the one still learning how to be human again, understood it was the only real strength that mattered. The boardroom felt like a courtroom, and Marcus was both defendant and judge. 2 months had passed since the press conference, 2 months of watching his carefully constructed empire show its cracks. The Singapore deal had collapsed when investors got cold feet about his apparent instability. 3 major clients had moved their contracts to competitors, citing concerns about TechVision's shifting priorities. Stock prices had dropped 18%, and the financial press was having a field day analyzing what they called Marcus Chen's spectacular downfall. But something unexpected had happened alongside the losses. Smaller companies, startups run by entrepreneurs who valued ethics over pure profit, had started reaching out. Universities wanted to partner on the educational initiatives David had designed. Nonprofit organizations were calling with collaboration proposals. And most surprisingly, several TechVision employees had come forward to say they'd been waiting years for the company to stand for something beyond shareholder returns. The board had demanded this meeting, and Marcus knew what was coming. He'd spent the previous night with David and Emma, eating pizza and talking about what failure might look like, how to rebuild from nothing if necessary. Emma had looked at him with those penetrating eyes and said something that had given him courage for today. "You're not losing, Mr. Chen. You're shedding. Like a snake sheds its skin when it gets too tight. It looks scary and messy, but underneath is something new that fits better." Now, sitting across from 12 hostile faces, Marcus wondered if Emma's optimism would prove prophetic or merely naive. Richard Ashford didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Marcus, we're here to discuss your removal as CEO of TechVision Industries. The board has lost confidence in your leadership, and frankly, your recent behavior has been erratic at best and delusional at worst. We're prepared to offer you a generous severance package in exchange for your resignation." "I built this company," Marcus said quietly. "Every line of code in our first product, I wrote. Every investor meeting, every late night, every sacrifice. This is my life's work." "Was your life's work," Margaret Winters corrected. Past tense. Because the man who built TechVision understood that business requires focus and rationality. The man sitting in front of us today is more interested in playing savior to a janitor and his disturbed child than in fulfilling his fiduciary duties. Marcus felt anger flash hot and sharp. "Emma is not disturbed. And if acknowledging that makes me unfit to lead, then maybe this company isn't worth leading." "Finally, something we agree on," Richard said. "You're not fit to lead, not anymore. We have the votes to remove you, Marcus. You can resign with dignity, or we can make this ugly. Your choice." For a moment, Marcus saw his entire life laid out before him. He could fight this, drag it into legal battles that would consume years and millions of dollars. He could try to rally shareholders, appeal to the employees who'd expressed support. He could wage war to keep control of the company he'd birthed from nothing. Or he could let go. The old Marcus would have fought with everything he had, would have seen surrender as death. But the new Marcus, the one who'd learned that strength sometimes meant accepting loss, understood that holding on to TechVision might mean losing something more important. His integrity. His newfound humanity. The relationships that had started teaching him what actually mattered. "I'll resign," Marcus said, and the words felt like both defeat and liberation. "But I have conditions." The board members exchanged glances, surprised by his quick capitulation. Thomas Park leaned forward. "You're not exactly in a position to negotiate." "I'm not negotiating," Marcus clarified. "I'm stating requirements for a peaceful transition. You want to avoid ugly legal battles and negative publicity. I can give you that. But in exchange, every program I started for employee welfare continues. The education initiatives David Miller developed stay funded. And the foundation supporting children like Emma gets endowed properly before I leave." "That's millions of dollars," Margaret protested. "That's my price for going quietly," Marcus said. "You'll save more than that in legal fees and stock price stabilization. Consider it a bargain." The board caucused, voices low and tense. Marcus waited, feeling strangely calm. He'd spent weeks dreading this moment, fearing the loss of identity that would come with losing his position. But sitting here now, he realized the loss had already happened. The Marcus Chen who defined himself by corporate success had died in that plain malfunction. The man he was becoming didn't need a CEO title to have value. Richard turned back to him. "Fine. We'll honor the existing commitments to those programs. But you're out by end of month, and you sign a non-compete agreement. We don't need you starting a rival company with our trade secrets." "Agreed," Marcus said. "I have no interest in competing with you. I'm done with this industry entirely." That surprised them, he could see it in their faces. They'd expected him to fight or to pivot to a competitor. The idea that he might simply walk away from technology, from the world he'd dominated for 2 decades, didn't compute. The paperwork took 3 hours to finalize. Lawyers appeared with documents, terms were debated and adjusted, and slowly the dismantling of Marcus Chen's empire became official. He signed his name over and over, each signature feeling like releasing a weight he hadn't realized was crushing him. When it was done, when he'd officially ceased to be CEO of Tech Vision Industries, Marcus stood and looked around the boardroom one last time. He'd spent thousands of hours in this space, making decisions that affected hundreds of employees and millions of dollars. He'd celebrated victories here and weathered crises. This room had been the center of his universe. Now it felt small and suffocating, like a cage he'd mistaken for a kingdom. "One more thing," Marcus said as he reached the door. The board members looked up, wary. "In 5 years, when you're still chasing quarterly earnings and sacrificing people for profit margins, I want you to remember this moment. Remember that you had a chance to build something meaningful, and you chose money instead. That's your legacy. Live with it." He walked out without waiting for a response, and with each step away from that boardroom, Marcus felt lighter. By the time he reached the building's exit, he was almost running, desperate to be free of the place that had defined him for so long. David was waiting outside, leaning against a lamppost with 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Marcus without a word, and they stood together in the autumn sunshine, watching people hurry past on their lunch breaks. "So," David finally said, "how does it feel to be unemployed?" "Terrifying," Marcus admitted. "Also kind of amazing." "Is that normal?" "I've been unemployed more times than I can count," David said. "It's always terrifying. The amazing part is newer for me, but I like it." They walked together through the city, no destination in mind, just moving. Marcus told David about the meeting, about the conditions he'd negotiated, about the board's shock when he'd agreed to leave without a fight. "You could have fought them," David observed. "You had the resources, probably some legal grounds. Why didn't you?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "Because Emma was right. I was shedding something that didn't fit anymore. Trying to keep Tech Vision would have meant becoming the old Marcus again, the one who fought every battle and won at any cost. I don't want to be that person, even if it means losing everything I built." "You didn't lose everything," David said. "You lost a company. That's not the same thing." They ended up at the apartment building, where Emma was waiting with Mrs. Patterson and several other neighbors. Someone had baked a cake, chocolate with uneven frosting that clearly came from Emma's enthusiastic assistance. A banner hung across the community room reading "Congratulations on your freedom" in wobbly letters. "We heard about what happened," Mrs. Patterson said, pulling Marcus into a hug that smelled like lavender and home cooking. "Figured you could use some celebrating." "Celebrating?" Marcus was confused. "I just lost my company." "No," Carlos said, appearing with plates and forks. "You escaped from your company. Different thing entirely. We've all been trapped in jobs that sucked our souls dry. Getting free is worth celebrating, even when it's scary." The impromptu party filled the community room with laughter and music from someone's Bluetooth speaker. Children ran around while adults shared food and stories. Emma appointed herself Marcus's official host, making sure he met everyone and heard their stories of career changes and reinventions. "Mr. Henderson used to be a lawyer," Emma told him, pointing to the elderly man Marcus had met on his first visit. "But he hated it, so when he retired, he started teaching kids to read at the library. Now he says he's finally doing something that matters." Mr. Henderson joined them, moving slowly with his cane. "Spent 40 years defending corporations and lawsuits. Made excellent money, hated myself a little more each year. Should have quit decades earlier, but I was afraid. Fear keeps us in cages we could walk out of any time. I'm afraid now," Marcus confessed. "I don't know who I am without the company. I've been CEO for so long, I forgot how to be anything else." "That's good," Mr. Henderson said, surprising him. "Fear means you're aware of the stakes. It's the people who aren't afraid who should worry you. They're either fools or liars." Young G, the college student Emma had helped through depression, brought Marcus a slice of cake. "I changed my major last month," she said. I was studying business because my parents wanted me to, but I hated it. So I switched to social work. My parents are furious, say I'm throwing away a lucrative career. But I'd rather be poor and helpful than rich and miserable. Sometimes, Marcus said slowly, I think poor and helpful is actually richer than rich and miserable. Just not in ways that show up on a balance sheet. Now you're getting it, David said, joining their conversation. Took me years to figure that out. I used to envy people like who you were, people with money and power and success. Then I realized most of them were emptier than I ever was, even when I was eating ramen for the third night in a row because it's all I could afford. The party continued into the evening, and Marcus found himself truly relaxed for the first time in memory. No one here cared that he'd just lost his CEO position. No one was judging his worth by his net worth or measuring his value by his professional achievements. They cared that he'd stood up for Emma and David. They cared that he'd chosen people over profit. They cared about who he was becoming, not who he'd been. Emma climbed into his lap at one point, cake frosting smeared on her face. Are you sad about losing your company? She asked. A little, Marcus admitted. Mostly I'm scared about what comes next. That's okay, Emma said with the wisdom that constantly surprised him. Being scared means you're alive. My daddy says dead people don't feel anything, so if you're feeling stuff, even scary stuff, it means you're living for real. Marcus hugged her, this remarkable child who'd saved his life in more ways than she'd probably ever understand. When did you get so wise? I've always been wise, Emma said matter-of-factly. But you weren't ready to hear it before. Now you are. That's not about me being smarter. That's about you being ready to listen. As the party wound down and neighbors drifted back to their apartments, Marcus helped David and Mrs. Patterson clean up. It was mundane work, washing dishes and folding tables, but it felt meaningful in a way that closing million-dollar deals never had. What will you do now? Mrs. Patterson asked as she dried plates. A man like you, you're not built to sit idle. I don't know yet, Marcus said honestly. For the first time in my adult life, I genuinely don't have a plan. It's terrifying and kind of exhilarating. Good, Mrs. Patterson said firmly. Plans are overrated. Some of the best things in life happen when we stop planning and start living. David walked Marcus to his car later, Emma already asleep on his shoulder. Thank you for today, David said quietly. I know celebrating your job loss seems strange, but I wanted you to know that losing your title doesn't mean losing your value. Not to us. I'm starting to understand that, Marcus said. Though I'll admit, part of me is panicking about what comes next. I've got enough money to never work again, but I can't imagine just doing nothing. Then don't do nothing, David suggested. Do something that matters. You've got resources and connections and experience. Use them for good instead of for profit. The foundation you're endowing for kids like Emma, actually run it. Don't just write checks, be involved. Learn what these kids need and help provide it. Marcus felt something click into place, a sense of purpose that didn't require a corner office or a CEO title. You know what? That's exactly what I'm going to do. David smiled, shifting Emma's sleeping weight. Good. Because I wasn't asking. I was telling you. Someone needs to run that foundation, and it should be someone who understands what it's like to almost lose everything and find out that what you lost wasn't what mattered anyway. As Marcus drove home that night, his penthouse apartment awaited him with its expensive emptiness. But for the first time, that emptiness felt temporary, like something he could change rather than something that defined him. He'd lost his company, his title, his identity as CEO of Tech Vision Industries. But he'd gained something infinitely more valuable. He'd gained the freedom to become whoever he wanted to be next, unshackled from the person he'd forced himself to be for 20 years. And he'd gained a community that valued him for reasons that had nothing to do with his net worth and everything to do with his willingness to choose integrity over convenience. The old Marcus would have called this failure. The new Marcus understood it was the first real success of his life. 1 year later, Marcus stood in the bright, welcoming lobby of the Second Chance Center, watching children laugh and play in spaces designed specifically for kids who experience the world differently. The building had once been a struggling community center that he'd purchased and transformed, working alongside David and a team of educators, therapists, and parents who understood that different didn't mean broken. Emma ran past, leading a group of younger children in some elaborate game that involved a lot of giggling and dramatic gestures. She'd grown taller, more confident, and the haunted look she'd carried after the media harassment had faded into healthy childhood joy. She waved at Marcus without stopping, too caught up in play to pause, and that casual acknowledgement meant everything to him. "She's doing well," Dr. Okonkwo said, joining Marcus by the window. She'd left her position at Riverside Academy to become the center's director, drawn by the opportunity to create something revolutionary. "All the kids are." "You've built something special here, Marcus." "We've built something special," Marcus corrected. "I just provided the resources. You and David and all the parents, you're the ones doing the actual work." The center served 40 children now, kids whose abilities ranged from Emma's intuitive knowing to others who saw patterns invisible to most people, who heard frequencies beyond normal range, who processed information in ways that traditional education couldn't accommodate. Instead of trying to fix them or force them into conventional boxes, the center celebrated their uniqueness while teaching them how to navigate a world that often feared what it didn't understand. David emerged from his office, carrying papers and wearing reading glasses that made him look professorial. He'd discovered a talent for program development and fundraising, connecting with donors who valued impact over prestige. The exhaustion that had marked his features a year ago had been replaced by purpose and adequate sleep. "We got approved for the expansion," David announced, grinning. "The city's letting us take over the building next door. We can double our capacity by next fall." Marcus felt pride swell in his chest, the kind that came from watching something meaningful grow. This was so different from the hollow satisfaction of quarterly earnings reports. This was real impact, measurable in children's smiles and parents' relief and communities strengthened. His phone buzzed with a message from his former assistant, now working at a nonprofit that aligned with her values. The Singapore deal he'd walked away from had indeed collapsed, but not because of his absence. The company he would have merged with had been hiding massive fraud, uncovered 6 months after he'd delayed the meeting. Walking away hadn't just saved his soul, it had saved him from a catastrophic business disaster. Emma had tried to warn him about that too, in her oblique way, mentioning that the deal felt wrong in a way she couldn't articulate. He'd listened, not because he believed in psychic predictions, but because he'd learned to trust the instincts of people who saw the world clearly. "I've been thinking," Marcus said to David as they walked through the center together, "about what comes next. We've proven the model works here. What if we replicated it? Other cities, other communities. There are kids like Emma everywhere, and most of them don't have access to anything like this." David's eyes lit up. "I've been thinking the same thing. Young G actually wrote her senior thesis on scalable models for alternative education. She's got some brilliant ideas about how to franchise this without losing the personal touch that makes it work." They found young G in the art room, helping a child who painted sounds as colors create a vibrant canvas. She'd graduated college last month and immediately joined the center's staff, bringing fresh perspectives and boundless energy. "Mr. Chen wants to talk expansion," David said, and young G's face transformed with excitement. For the next hour, they discussed possibilities and challenges, dreaming bigger while staying grounded in practical realities. Marcus listened more than he talked, having learned that the best ideas came from people doing the actual work, not from executives in distant offices. Mrs. Patterson arrived with her famous cookies, a weekly tradition that the kids anticipated eagerly. She'd become the center's unofficial grandmother, providing warmth and wisdom in equal measure. "You boys planning world domination?" she teased. "Just trying to help more kids," Marcus said, accepting a cookie still warm from her oven. "Same thing," Mrs. Patterson replied. "Help enough kids become their best selves, you've changed the world. Just happens one child at a time instead of all at once." That evening, Marcus joined David and Emma for dinner at their new apartment, larger and brighter than the old one but still in the same building, same community. Emma had insisted they not move far from her friends, and David had agreed, understanding that wealth was meaningless if it separated you from the people who made life rich. "Mr. Chen," Emma said over spaghetti that she'd helped cook. "Can I ask you something?" "Always," Marcus replied. "Are you happy now? Like, really happy, not just pretending?" Marcus considered the question seriously, giving it the weight Emma's questions always deserved. "I'm happier than I've ever been," he said honestly. "I'm also more uncertain, more vulnerable, and occasionally more scared. But yes, underneath all of that, I'm deeply happy." "Good," Emma said, satisfied. "Because when I saw you at the airport that day, you were so sad inside. Like a light that had gone out. But now your light's back on. It's nice." David met Marcus's eyes across the table, and something passed between them, an understanding born from shared struggle and mutual respect. They'd both been broken in different ways, both learned that strength came from connection rather than isolation, both discovered that the best version of themselves required vulnerability and courage in equal measure. After dinner, Marcus drove through the city toward his new home, a modest brownstone in a neighborhood where people actually knew their neighbors. He'd sold the penthouse months ago, unable to bear the isolation anymore. His new place had a front porch where he sat some evenings, talking with whoever passed by. His net worth had decreased substantially, money poured into the center and other initiatives that would never generate financial returns. His former colleagues probably pitied him or felt vindicated in their assessment that he'd lost his mind. But Marcus had never felt wealthier, measuring richness in relationships and purpose rather than dollars and status. The old Marcus had almost died in a plane crash, saved at the last moment by a child brave enough to speak truth to power. But the real salvation hadn't been avoiding physical death. It had been embracing a different kind of life, one where being human mattered more than being successful, where vulnerability was strength and community was currency. Emma had saved his life twice. Once by warning him about the plane, and once by showing him what life could look like when you stopped hiding behind walls and started living authentically. Both rescues had been terrifying. Both had been necessary. Both had been gifts beyond measure. As Marcus sat on his porch that night, watching neighbors walk dogs and children play in the street, he thought about the man he'd been a year ago. That man would have been horrified by this modest existence, would have seen it as failure incarnate. But that man had been dying slowly, suffocating under the weight of success that meant nothing. This man, the one who'd learned to listen to janitors and trust 7-year-olds, who'd chosen integrity over empire and community over control, this man was finally, genuinely alive. And somewhere across the city, in an apartment filled with love and laughter, a little girl with extraordinary sight smiled in her sleep, knowing that the man she'd saved had finally saved himself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.